In the spring of 1945, the workshops of a company called Rheinmetall sat quiet across Germany for the first time in 6 years. At Dusseldorf, at Berlin, at a sprawling ammunition works in the countryside called Unterlüss. The machines that had built the guns of the Wehrmacht went cold. The most famous of those guns was a high-velocity anti-aircraft piece, so effective against tanks that crews on both sides simply called it the 88. Rheinmetall contributed the barrel design behind that gun, part of a secret rearmament effort led by the steelmaker Krupp that began in the 1930s, carried out under cover of a partnership with the Swedish firm Bofors to sidestep the disarmament limits of the Treaty of Versailles. By 1943, several thousand forced labourers, prisoners of war and civilians pulled from occupied countries were already working at the Unterlüss site alone, and in 1944, roughly 800 Jewish women were brought from Auschwitz to a nearby satellite camp known as Lager Tannenberg to labour for the company. The Allies who arrived in the spring of 1945 had a plan for a company like this one. It was not a plan to punish Rheinmetall. It was a plan to make sure a company like it could never exist again. Rheinmetall was not new to war. The company was incorporated in 1889 under the name Rheinische Metallwaren und Maschinenfabrik to supply munitions to the German Empire, and an engineer named Heinrich Erhardt built and led its Dusseldorf works for its first 3 decades. The shortened trade name, Rheinmetall, stuck. It armed Germany through the First World War, survived the disarmament clauses that followed it, and in 1936 merged with the machine-building firm Borsig to become Rheinmetall, the name it carried through the Second World War. By the time that war ended, the firm's factories at Dusseldorf, Berlin and Unterlüss were among the most important ammunition and artillery works in the country, turning out anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, and shells on a scale few German companies could match. That plan had a name. Under the Potsdam Agreement and Allied Control Council, Law No. 5, the occupying powers set out to break up Germany's heavy industry so completely that the country could never rebuild an arms sector at all. Steelmakers, chemical conglomerates, and weapons manufacturers were marked for what the Allies called decartelization, the forced breakup of the combines that had armed Hitler. Krupp's leadership stood trial at Nuremberg for using slave labour. Alfred Krupp himself was convicted at Nuremberg in 1948 and sentenced to 12 years in prison, though he was released early, after roughly 2.5 years, in 1951. No Rheinmetall executive faced a war crimes tribunal of that kind, but the company itself was placed on the same industrial target list as Krupp's empire. Allied planners were not interested in a fine or a reorganisation. They wanted the company gone. For a while, it looked like they would get their way. Rheinmetall's plant at Tegel, on the edge of Berlin, was stripped by the Red Army in 1945. Its usable machinery dismantled and hauled east as reparations. French occupation authorities later took over the rebuilt sections of that same site and dismantled them again between 1947 and 1949. Every one of Rheinmetall's German factories was placed under a total production ban, forbidden from making so much as a spare part for a weapon. By the time the accounting was finished, the company had lost the equivalent of 620 million Reichsmarks, and its name had become, in the eyes of the men writing the piece, a name that belonged to history and nowhere else. Decades later, Rheinmetall would publish its own account of this period, acknowledging plainly that forced labourers and camp prisoners had worked its wartime production lines under guard. It is not a history the company denies. It is one it now states for the record. The production ban held for 5 years. To survive, Rheinmetall turned to whatever civilian goods a peacetime Europe would buy. The company that had built anti-tank guns began building shock absorbers and typewriters instead, small machine work out of what remained of its Dusseldorf and Berlin sites. In 1951, the firm was formally reorganized and reincorporated as a civilian manufacturer, a company with no legal path back to weapons and, in the minds of the officials who had drafted its punishment, no future in them either. Then the Cold War changed the math. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. Western planners who had spent a decade trying to make sure Germany could never rearm now needed exactly that, a rearmed West German army standing against the Soviet bloc. The production bans on companies like Rheinmetall were lifted, and the company that had been marked for dismantling 10 years earlier was invited back into the one business it had always known. In November of 1956, Rheinmetall's engineers began work on what West Germany called the Standard Panzer program, the tank that would become the Leopard. The finished vehicle entered Bundeswehr service in September of 1965, armed with a British-designed 105mm gun that Rheinmetall built under license. The company that once made Hitler's anti-tank gun was now making the main gun for NATO's newest tank. What followed was not a quiet return to modest, licensed production. Rheinmetall went on to design and build the main gun for the Leopard 2, a 120mm smoothbore cannon that became the standard tank gun across most of NATO. It built ammunition, armoured vehicles, air defence systems and engine components, buying up smaller German defence and automotive firms as it grew. The company the Allies had marked for permanent dissolution instead became one of the largest defence manufacturers in Europe, decade after decade, largely out of public view. Today, Rheinmetall is not a footnote in German industrial history. It is headquartered in the same city, Dusseldorf, where Heinrich Erhard built its first factory in 1889, and it is now the largest dedicated defence company in Germany, and among the largest in Europe, ranked by industry analysts as the world's 20th largest defence firm by arms sales as of 2024. In its 2025 fiscal year, the company reported sales of €9.9 billion, a rise of 29% over the year before, with operating profit up by nearly a third to €1.8 billion. Its order backlog, contracts already signed and waiting to be filled, stood at a record roughly €63 billion. The company employed about 40,000 people and had announced plans to grow that workforce towards 70,000. Its shares, once a quiet, mid-sized industrial stock trading under €100, became one of the most valuable listings on Germany's blue-chip stock index, with the company's total market value passing €80 billion. European governments now rank rising defence spending as one of the continent's defining budget priorities of the decade, and Rheinmetall's order books reflect that demand directly. Industry analysts now rank Rheinmetall the third largest dedicated defence company in Europe, behind only the French firm Thales and the Italian firm Leonardo. And the company has expanded into naval shipbuilding as well, acquiring the German shipbuilder Blohm & Voss. Shares that traded under €100 a decade ago now trade above €1,200, and the company's chief executive, Armin Paperger, has told investors he expects annual revenue to keep climbing well past €20 billion within the next few years. None of this happened because the plan to dismantle Rheinmetall failed by accident. It happened because the same governments that once wrote the order to break the company apart later decided, for their own strategic reasons, that they needed exactly what it built. The 88mm gun that made Rheinmetall infamous is a museum piece now, mounted outside war memorials and displayed behind velvet rope in military collections. The company that built it never went to a museum. It went back to work, first quietly with shock absorbers and typewriters, then openly with tank guns bearing NATO's own specifications, and finally as the largest arms maker on a continent that had once sworn its kind would never build weapons again. A company marked for extinction in 1945 is, 8 decades later, worth many times what it was worth even 10 years ago, employing far more people than the plant floors the Red Army tore down at Tegel, and supplying weapons systems to more governments than it ever did under the flag it served in the war. The order to break it apart for good is a matter of historical record. So is the fact that it did not work. If you want to see what happened to more of the war machine the Allies once swore they would tear apart for good, like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more from this channel.